Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Double Down News Live. It's been an incredibly busy week, but rather than looking back, today we're going to be looking ahead to what is going to be a major event tomorrow as Dominic Cummings prepares to appear before a parliamentary committee to testify on the government's handling of coronavirus. I'm sure you've all seen this being billed as the major event that it is sure to be. Before we get going, it's important to note, as always, that this session and all of the work produced by Double Down News would not be possible without the incredible support of our committed patrons. So if you enjoy the show or the other content created by Double Down News, then please do visit the Patreon link in the description and join us today. As always, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, like this video to help us with the algorithms, and share the video as well. Now, to discuss Dominic, the wider story around the herd immunity scandal and more, we are delighted to be joined by Sam Bright. Sam, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Lynn. Lovely to join you.
We really appreciate you being here. Sam is Chief Politics and Investigations Reporter from Byline Times and has been covering much of this since the very beginning of it all. And I mean, if we can jump straight in, Sam, before we go to some of the questions that we've got piling in. As I said, I know that yourself and colleagues have written quite extensively on the herd immunity story at Byline. I wondered if you might lay it out for our audience before we get into how Dominic Cummings might start spinning it tomorrow, if you like.
Yeah, so herd immunity, basically, for an essential definition for people, is the process whereby a disease, in this case coronavirus, is allowed to spread rapidly through a population whilst vulnerable people are shielded. So the theory is, in this case, that coronavirus would spread around, would infect people like perhaps you or I, who are young, who don't have underlying health conditions. We catch the disease, we don't die, we gain immunity, and then we shield, theoretically, those who might suffer badly. And then we reach herd immunity, whereby the disease just doesn't transmit anymore and doesn't do any damage. That is a theory, and it is just, for so many reasons, it has holes in it, as I'm sure we'll touch upon. Essentially, generally, you get to herd immunity with a vaccine. Like, this isn't really done for just ordinary transmission between humans. It's not a recommended epidemiological strategy, but it's said that, and Dominic Cummings alleges this, I think pretty robustly, that herd immunity was the strategy of the British government at the outset of the pandemic in sort of late February, early March of 2020, before it allegedly rapidly changed its approach to lockdown, suppression, test and trace, etc. So yeah, that's essentially the nuts and bolts of it, for basics.
Yeah, so you mentioned there Cummings. I mean, to come on to him, I'm just gonna pull up some of his tweets. I mean, I'm sure some of our viewers will have seen that Dominic Cummings has been doing this sort of mega thread on Twitter over the course of the last few days that he's been adding to on an almost daily basis. As you can see here, this is tweet 60 of God knows how many there have been now. But in this one in particular, I mean, he's pointing to documentation that was released at the time in black and white, basically saying, this was the plan all along in terms of the preparation was herd immunity. What's been your sort of reflection on some of these tweets, Sam, that Dominic Cummings has been putting out from his at Dominic2306 Twitter account?
I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, for one, it sort of looks like a bot account, which is deeply ironic, like, given that Cummings was behind the fake news sort of propaganda of the Brexit referendum, that he's actually propagating his views via what looks like a bot account. But I mean, what I think is my big question is he just outing himself here by saying that herd immunity was always the strategy? Because this was a man, lest we forget, who's at the heart of Downing Street. was the man pulling the strings, was the puppet master to Boris Johnson throughout this crisis. And yet Cummings is sort of saying, oh, all these other people believed herd immunity, but he never actually, if you read the thread, he never acknowledges what he thought or what he was suggesting at the time. And it might be tangential to the story, but it allows us to reflect on the credibility of what Dominic Cummings is saying and whether we can believe his allegations in relation to herd immunity. We need to know what he was thinking, and he needs to say in committee tomorrow, I think, quite plainly, if he got it wrong and he did believe in herd immunity to start off with, he should hold his hands up and he should say, I believed it, I was wrong, but in the interest of the British public and a frank knowledge of our Prime Minister and who he is and what he believes and the future of the country, these are the facts and this is what we should know about it. His thread is fascinating, not just because of herd immunity. Herd immunity is the central thing, but he's quite damning about the role of the media in all this, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. But he actually is highly critical, as we all are, of the media ecosystem in this country and the lobby system. And he said that they got it wrong as much as the government did, which I think is something that that hopefully will be brought out in the committee tomorrow, that it's the government in allegiance with its mates, formerly along Fleet Street, that allowed this crisis to take root and essentially kill 150,000 people. I spoke to Sir David King, who used to be the UK's chief scientist, just a couple of weeks ago, and he said herd immunity killed 100,000 people. 100,000 people died because of these mistakes, that Boris Johnson and whoever else at the heart of government and whoever was in those meetings at the start of the pandemic, which is just appalling.
Yeah, it's really horrific, and you drew on a really important point there that a lot of people are asking in the comments. Actually, that is this just all about Dominic Cummings trying to save face? Because, as you say, he was at the heart of this government that was making the decisions. Two things that spring to mind immediately about Dominic Cummings' involvement was, first of all, obviously there were the big expose piece that was done after the initial lockdown, I believe, where Cummings was outed as being one of the voices who had said, it's only going to affect pensioners. We don't need to be too concerned about it, or allegedly had said that. And second, also the fact that he changed his blog sort of later on as well. So he kind of amended his own role in the crisis. So, how reliable can we take his testimony to be tomorrow? Is he just going to try to edit his own role in this crisis? Or should we see him as, a kind of reformed character who wants to get to the heart of the problem?
I think with a pinch of salt, certainly. I think the thing about Dominic Cummings is that he's a great unknown. So he's never given that many interviews. He had to basically be dragged into the garden of Downing Street. I think it was a year to the day ago that he sat down in front of the spotlight of the media to explain his actions over Barnard Castle. He's not a man who puts himself in the public eye. And there's lots of speculation, obviously, like he's been a central character of British politics for the past few years. So there's a lot being alleged about him, that he's supposedly one thing or another. The thing is that a lot of that writing has been done by the lobby, which he himself has criticised, and we've criticised extensively as well. So that it's sort of like a big jumble of who to believe in this saga. I think just looking at outcomes and looking at what we all know about the process and how lockdown happened and the government communications during the phase that he's talking about in particular, so March last year and after that stage, he's painting a picture that we can all see, that we all saw happen in real time, that the government came out. Patrick Vallance, the current chief scientist, came out and talked about herd immunity as a strategy. David Halpern of the behavioural unit in Downing Street talked about herd immunity. There's evidence there. This isn't Cummings just going off and blowing a fuse randomly. We've seen evidence of this, as we picked up at Byline Times exactly a year ago. And then the government botched its communications repeatedly. It's continuing to do so. Yesterday, I mean, it was announced yesterday that it's being advised that certain areas of the country people in certain areas of the country shouldn't travel outside of their area, right, because of the variants. This guidance was apparently published 2 weeks ago, and the government didn't tell anybody. That has been the mode of the government over the past year, has been total communications incompetence, which is what Cummings is laying out essentially. So I think we can treat his evidence as, you know, pretty valid where all that is concerned. As to whether he wants to sort of rewrite his name in the history books, I mean, I think anybody would. He does not want to be slapped in the inquiry as someone who caused the deaths of 150,000 people. So I think we're going to have to factor that in as well, that he's going to try and dodge his own role in all this. But ultimately, I think the most important thing will be what he says about other people, especially the Prime Minister, what he says about what Boris Johnson did during this crisis, because he's the man at the heart of it all. And Cummings knows whatever he alleges about Boris Johnson, they're going to come back at him really hard, as they already have done. Downing Street have come after Cummings hard since he's left. So Cummings knows that whatever he says needs to be backed up by evidence. And I think as a result, we can treat what he says about the Prime Minister and senior ministers as pretty on point.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to come back to his sort of points about the lobby and also what he's going to say about the Prime Minister. But just to return maybe to a point that's kind of neglected is, you know, the comms, as you say, throughout the crisis have been an absolute disaster from the government, from the finish even to today, as you say, releasing that guidance on Friday about not being able to travel out of the areas and people not even knowing even today that's the case. I think I saw even the chair of NHS England or something was travelling into Bolton, despite it being government advice not to do so, which is pretty incredible. But you know, Dominic Cummings is sort of famed as a communications guru, like an expert in terms of, you know, his expertise and everything. You know, despite obviously concerns about what he did around vote leave and so on, his fame has been made around being able to communicate a message and so on, which quite clearly his early involvement around the beginning of the pandemic, for whatever reason, he didn't cut through. I mean, what do you think he's going to have to say on that tomorrow? Because people are surely going to put to him, you know, the communication message failed, it didn't work, you were there. You were part of the team who were trying to communicate the message. Is he just going to blame that on the media, or do you think he might take a bit of responsibility?
I'd hate to presuppose what someone like Dominic Cummings might say or think. It's quite a dangerous game, being a misfit and a weirdo, self-proclaimed misfit and weirdo that he is. But I imagine it'll be several things. I mean, there's several themes that have sort of popped up through his, as you say, mammoth Twitter thread, which are, one, the civil service and Whitehall, which has been his campaign. It was his campaign throughout government, was to reform Whitehall. He thinks it's broken. He thinks that the civil service promotes incompetence. And he talks a lot about valuing process rather than outcomes. That's, you know, what he thinks the civil service do. So I think he'll blame mandarins, which is quite helpful for him because the civil service can't defend itself. You know, the civil service is broadly faceless, as we saw in the case of, you know, Priti Patel and Philip Rutnam, that, you know, he could only say a few things to the media when she alleged that, you know, when he alleged that she was carrying out bullying. You know, broadly, civil servants are faceless. So he'll say that. I think he'll blame the media as well, quite heavily, and he'll blame his colleagues in Downing Street. He has not pulled any punches about saying that people at the top of government were incompetent and they were the wrong people in charge. I think he'll direct a lot of his focus at Hancock and the Department of Health and Social Care. He mentioned it the last time he was at committee, the fact that they totally cocked up PPE procurement, which again is an issue that we've covered extensively over the past year. And I think he'll turn his guns on Hancock and everybody else apart from himself. basically. And I think we'll see the MPs will probably be more interested in what he says about other people than what he says about himself. So he'll probably get away with it.
Indeed. I mean, we've seen Robert Peston tonight tweeting, and I think he's written a piece in The Spectator about some of the suggestions of what Cummings is going to say about the Prime Minister. One of them is that he'll allege that Johnson said that COVID is only killing 80-year-olds when it came to delaying the lockdown in the autumn, which is quite similar to what it was suggested that Cummings himself had said previously about COVID only affecting the elderly. Peston, of course, was the one, I believe, 12th of March, who wrote the initial piece saying that herd immunity was the government's plan. I mean, how worried do you think Johnson will be personally about this? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stuff going around that, opposition MPs on the committee tomorrow will be calling for him to resign. That Cummings will be questioned about the, let the bodies pile high comments and whether whether those were said, whether it's true. Also questions about, the refurbishment of his flat and so on, which seem slightly less important in the context of the COVID crisis. But a lot of this might come out tomorrow. I mean, how concerned do you think they are in Number 10 tonight about what Cummings is going to say tomorrow?
I think they'll be concerned, and Boris Johnson will be concerned, because Boris Johnson is vain and he likes to promote a certain brand of himself, and he wants to be this Churchillian leader that led Britain through its 21st century war. Like, that is clearly how he sees himself. He got Brexit done, conquered coronavirus, and then he can waltz the next election, he hopes. So no, it will give him, in terms of his personal brand, it will give him concern. I don't think it will give them, unless Cummings. So the one way that I think it will hurt them, and that he may be concerned, the one aspect that he might be concerned about, is if Cummings does have a recording, that if Cummings does have a smoking gun of Boris saying that he was willing to let thousands pile up. That's, apart from that, I don't think politically this will really touch Boris Johnson. I'm really sad to say. I think that Cummings's personal brand took a big hit. I mean, it's taken a hit for a year, but it took a massive hit during the Barnard Castle episode. And the government will basically respond by saying, this is the man who drove up to, which is ironic considering the government defended him at the time, but they'll say, this is the man who drove up to Barnard Castle to defend it, to test his eyesight. You shouldn't trust him, or at least they'll imply that. They imply that heavily, that Cummings is not a man who should be trusted. And I think a lot of the nation will be like, are we going to trust Cummings? Or are we going to trust the guy who has brought us the vaccine, as they see it? And Boris will win that. Boris will win that argument hands down. And if you think as well, Cummings has one chance pretty much to get his message across to a national audience, which is tomorrow, and to a small degree through his tweets, but even he will think that Twitter won't cut through to the general public. Boris Johnson has an opportunity to get his message across as many times a week during Prime Minister's questions, during press conferences, wherever he goes, on the street, press releases. Like, Boris will be able to hammer home the argument that that Cummings isn't to be trusted. And the question is, the only thing that could damage him, Boris as well, is Boris Johnson. Shouldn't call him Boris. Is if Conservative MPs turn against him, and they're not. The Conservative Party is ruthless, and it's got an 80-seat majority. It sees in large part thanks to Boris Johnson. And so no matter what he did, it's the famous Donald Trump quote. If he walked down Fifth Avenue or whatever in New York and shot someone in the head, would he have lost the presidency? Trump reckoned not. And it seems to be quite similar with Boris Johnson. Like 100,000 people have died, on his watch, thanks to herd immunity, the former chief scientist says. And yet, he's up in the polls. He basically won the local elections. It's sad, and it's disheartening, but we've got to fight the fight that's ahead of us and not the one that we wish was the case.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there, Sam. I mean, as you say, I saw your interview with Sir David King talking about the herd immunity issue and the idea that those 100,000 of the 150,000 deaths could have been avoided if that plan wasn't followed. The fact that that isn't more of a political scandal, that Boris Johnson is able to survive that really completely unscathed, and as you say, nearly 20 points ahead in some of the latest opinion polls is pretty worrying. So I'm a little bit unsure as to the effects of what tomorrow will have on his political career. Unless, as you say, I mean, if he has a recording of Johnson where you can quite easily hear him saying those comments, or, you know, he reveals a document that's really quite something, perhaps it will start to cut through. But you wonder at this moment in time whether the opposition would even use it, to be entirely honest.
Yeah, you really do. I mean, it just hasn't been picked up on. It seems to be that they've left coronavirus as a topic now, as a battleground of British politics, like Brexit. You know, whether you believe in it or not, the opposition have left it to die, and that's what they're going to do with COVID, which, from the perspective of democracy and justice for the 150,000 people who have died, I mean, there is a basic moral responsibility on the opposition to hold the government to account, no matter what it does to your poll ratings. Because, frankly, you know, what they've done hasn't worked. So you might as well take the moral stance and stand up for the people who've died. You know, make the case that herd immunity was an absolute catastrophe. Because sooner or later, hopefully it will come out. And you want to stand on the right side of history. I think the Labour movement needs to stand on the right side of history here, just to give us all a bit of hope, if nothing else, and to be able to say that it is the party and the movement of social justice. Because I don't think there's a more important issue right now to the country than this.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Sam. And it's almost like there was a time to do it as well, where it felt like the country was really turning against Johnson and the handling of the pandemic. And obviously things have changed somewhat with the great reopening, as they're calling it, and the success of the vaccine rollout, which, you know, I'm sure we would both argue is down far more to the NHS than to Boris Johnson. But it certainly seems like there has been a real lack of opposition against what's happened. But before we move on to discuss what I think is a really important sort of take from Dominic Cummings, which is on the media and the lobby, and I think a lot of our audience will be interested in that. Cummings isn't only likely to raise questions about herd immunity tomorrow, but also questions around PPE, the lack of advice on social distancing. How important do you think some of these issues will be tomorrow in comparison to the herd immunity story? And, you know, another one that just springs into my mind there is also on the care home scandal, which I've seen raised as well on the chat, as I can see before me now. I mean, three areas that I'm sure he's likely to touch on. And I know that you yourself have just covered something quite big at Byline on a PPE scandal as well.
Yeah, so we've been sort of revealing these PPE contracts for the best part of a year. I mean, it's just like an avalanche of just steaming garbage from the government, like the contracts that they've been giving to. I mean, we calculated £1 billion worth of contracts during the past year to have been awarded to Conservative Party donors, and £2 billion to firms that have connections to the Conservative Party and the government. So £3 billion in total to mates of the regime. And this is an issue that, to be fair to Labour, we have seen them hammer on quite regularly. And I mean, there's kind of a dual question. Like, is it important? Yes, evidently it's important, because this is about our money, how it's spent, the fact that it's fueling, it's been sort of channeled into the pockets of Conservative Party donors. That is clearly, corruption. Like, that is, it's a form of corruption, like, one way or another. That's just fact. So that's important, again, for democracy, for the future of the UK. That is important. We cannot let this be a precedent that is set, that the Conservative Party can just do willy-nilly whenever there's a crisis. It just channels contracts to its mates. And then there's the question of whether it cuts through to the public, which I think is a separate one. And how you answer the first point doesn't dictate how you respond to the second point. I think, unfortunately, we haven't seen the cronyism stuff cut through as of yet. Wallpapergate did a little bit, but I saw a few polls suggesting that it was only among highly engaged people, highly politically engaged people, that it really changed their minds in the few days before before the local elections. That's not to say we shouldn't hammer home the point. It's just to be realistic about whether it's going to have political significance. I think it's far more important for Keir Starmer. I don't think I don't think scandals will bring down Boris Johnson. I think that if he is to be brought down, I think that the public have factored in Boris Johnson's his just attitude towards the world, towards women, towards people of black and minority ethnic groups, towards all sorts of different things, towards his chums. People, unfortunately, people in the marginal constituencies that he's appealing to, they don't care about that sort of stuff. So I'd say it's far more likely that the care home crisis is going to really cut through, especially because the Tories don't have a plan for social care. And that, famously in 2017, at the 2017 election, and that's what did for Theresa May. So if I was advising the opposition, which I'm, not, then I would be saying hammer social care as much as possible. I mean, it was a scandal in itself, and I think it's got far more potential to have a political impact, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on that point about the cronyism, Sam, I mean, do you think it's just expected of the Tories for them to be quite corrupt, and that's why it doesn't cut through? And I mean, if that is the case, how do you think it can start to cut through? Because I mean, it seems very pessimistic just to say that, they can just always get away with it. I mean, what's next? Do they just up it by another billion and carry on sort of wasting our money all the time? I mean, I've been staggered by the fact that, certainly at the beginning of the crisis, it was only sort of months previously that they were sort of attacking Labour's last manifesto as sort of crazy stuff, like the idea that you could spend 30 or 40 billion pounds on national infrastructure was for the sky, apparently. And then you had Johnson talking about Operation Moonshot or whatever, which was a 100 billion pound investment on something that was never going to happen. I mean, how can we sort of like start taking the argument to them on that?
I mean, I think it's a problem for the Labour Party specific, like quite directly the Labour Party rather than the Labour movement and the broader sort of coalition that we've built, our sort of organisations. I think that Labour clearly has a brand problem. So I was reading back through the Labour Together report on the last election, after the last election. And people supported Labour's policies when they were presented to them out of context. They said, we love, the broadband policy, we love some of the nationalisation policies, and obviously the workers' rights and the minimum wage policies. As soon as you attach the Labour Party's name to the policies, their popularity dropped massively. Okay, so there's a problem for the Labour Party there, which I think goes far beyond its policies. It goes to the root of like what the party stands for. And I think this applies to cronyism as well, in that I think people are shocked by it. And I think people detest it and loathe it, but they do not differentiate between this being a Conservative scandal and merely being a scandal that belongs to our whole political class. They will think that if Labour was in power, they'd be doing exactly the same. All politicians are tarred with the same brush currently, in large part thanks to the expenses scandal, because they all had their snouts in the trough. And so Labour, if it's to be successful, which I'm not sure about how it can do this, but if it wants to cut through on cronyism, it needs to show that this is a very defined Conservative Party problem, that it's not something that's associated with the Labour Party. And I think as it currently stands, I don't think the general population would believe the Labour Party if it tried to say that. I think it's got to go extremely bad. I think that there's got to be we've got to find something illegal that will prosecute them. That's essentially how high I think it has to go for this to make impact, which, full credit to Jolyon Morm and the Good Law Project. They're the guys who are taking the fight to them in the courts. And I'd say that's probably the most likely route to really scupper them to kneecap this government.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I could talk to you about the Labour Party all night, Sam, but we should probably move on to another topic of interest to us, which is the mainstream press, and return to some of what Dominic has been tweeting about. If we return to the beginning of the pandemic and around the start of the first lockdown, at the time, as you mentioned earlier, you had Patrick Vallance on the radio quite clearly spelling out the herd immunity plan. I remember tweeting that video at the time and had sort of blue tick journalists saying, that I was sort of wearing a tinfoil hat for pointing out exactly what he was saying on the radio, like word for word what he was saying. And I know a lot of people had the same thing. You had Johnson on, which was it, on This Morning, on the sofa, talking about taking it on the chin. It was quite clear, there was a sort of direction going on here. But apart from folks like yourselves at Byline, people at Double Down News, obviously, some of the independent media, nobody was really pointing this out. There didn't seem to be the outrage. In fact, it was quite the opposite. There was a concerted effort almost by the mainstream press and by those quite close to power to shut down people pointing out what the government themselves was saying in public. I mean, it's quite incredible, wasn't it, what was happening at the time?
It was, and it's happened ever since. It's just absurd. I mean, one thing that Cummings tweeted that drew my eye, which was, and that I fully agree with, which I never thought I'd say about Dominic Cummings, was that he said, "Many journalists want you to believe nonsense." And I think that is the case. I think that journalists, another thing he says as well, which I think really taps to the heart of this, is that most political journalists believe fundamentally in the system. So they think that the government doesn't either willfully or not try to kill people, whether, it's through accident, incompetence, whatever, that it's not the government's fault. The mainstream press has believed this throughout, that it's not really down to the government. They did try everything they could. Whereas the facts, the reality on the ground and the way that people have experienced this crisis has pointed in entirely the opposite direction. And ultimately, I think this stems back to the lobby system. So basically, for those who don't know, you have the parliamentary lobby, which is a fairly sizable group of political journalists who have passes. They're the only ones who have passes to gain access to the Palace of Westminster. And as a result, they have, all the big newspapers and broadcasters, they'll have several lobby correspondents. And as a result, they have a closeness, they have a certain closeness to power. They're the ones who can tittle tattle with MPs in the bars of Westminster late at night. And they gain a lot of sources close to government in the civil service, former advisors. So Dominic Cummings was, clearly a key source of Robert Peston. And Peston got his story this time last year from several sources high up in government. And so there is this sort of ingrained attitude in the media that if you expose the people at the heart of government, ultimately what you're doing is exposing your own sources. And no journalist wants to do that, because as soon as you expose your sources, as in expose what they're doing, not expose who they are, then they're never going to give you a story again, and you're going to get bumped off to some third-rate publication like Byline Times, which sure, woe is me, they'd never want, despite the fact that us and you guys were some of the only ones talking about this issue and getting it right at the time. And then the system perpetuates. You have the government spreading lies, the lobby not challenging them, and the government getting away with it. That's the system as it's constructed. So I was reading about the lobby the other day. The government created the lobby. This is not an institution created by journalists. It's an institution created by the government because it knew the stranglehold that it could have on the source of information if it brought journalists into its little club. And, we've seen that day in, day out during this crisis.
Sam, you've reminded me when they announced that they were going to start the public lobby broadcasts. When they hired Allegra Stratton, I believe, and said, they're going to start doing it publicly, and it's all going to be broadcast live and so on. I remember thinking at the time, there is no way they are going to do this, because they kind of rely on the sort of close-knit networks in order to keep their system running.
Yeah.
And so I was not surprised at all to see when that sort of fell apart.
Could you imagine if you or I were asking questions at the Downing Street briefings, or some of the alternative outlets, or some of the braver journalists at like Channel 4 who've been pushed to the margins, or Open Democracy, or The Guardian when they get to speak? Could you imagine that? Like, they could never countenance it for 5 seconds, because they know they'd actually get proper scrutiny for once.
Yeah, indeed. I think we can all reflect on, watching some of the sort of live Downing Street broadcasts over the crisis. Some of the questions that were asked, at times you were almost screaming at the TV on days where terrible news was announced and stuff wouldn't even get addressed by the nation's sort of leading lights of journalism, as we're led to believe. Pretty much something. But something that you brought up there about the system that I think is important is that we kind of saw the same thing happen with the austerity agenda as well, I feel, in the media. I don't know if you remember, but there was quite a huge report that came out from the BMA that said that austerity had left to 120,000 excess deaths. And it was kind of buried or mocked, or it didn't get much pickup. I'm sure it has since, and I'm sure people would be able to point to some mainstream coverage of it, but not very much in terms of the way that it was reported. And I remember having conversations with quite mainstream people at the time who kind of rubbished it and suggested that it wasn't a serious piece of work, but it was produced and published by the BMA, a fairly reputable organisation. And it seems like we've seen a similar thing happen here with this, where the media has kind of decided that forget the reputation of what's coming out, forget how important it is, forget the fact that 100,000 people, 120, 150,000 people have died, and it's not even worth talking about. And I just wonder if we're not going to see honest reporting happen on matters like these, on something where we've all been sort of confined to our homes for over a year, and we've seen this amount of people die, when do you think the sort of the journalism, the world of journalism, will change in this country?
Well, I think thankfully it is changing, and I'm sure you bang it home, on Double Down every week, as we do on Byline, that the people who support these sort of programs fund new journalism. I think there are thousands. Byline has grown rapidly. Double Down has obviously done the same, and I think that is testament to the fact that there are thousands of people out there who are sick of the press tiptoeing around issues that are costing lives, that are costing jobs, that are jeopardizing democracy, that the fundamentals that we're supposed to believe in as a nation and stand for. We wave the Union Jack around while tearing up the foundations of the mother of all parliaments, by proroguing it, and by lying to the House of Commons. You just have to check out, Peter Oborn's a great example of a principled One Nation Tory journalist who has renounced Boris Johnson utterly and has repeatedly pointed out his lies in the House of Commons. And it's just such a shame that he's one of the few who've had the courage to do that. I look at the media. I look at some of the front pages, some of the headlines of some of the big right-wing newspapers, and I often think that it's written from a different planet altogether, and it has such an agenda and such a clear ownership structure, political ownership structure behind it, that you might as well put the Communist Manifesto on the newsstands, because that's as impartial and as non-ideological as the Daily Mail from a right-wing point of view. You know, they've bashed away at herd immunity for the whole year. They've wanted to unlock, to let us all frolic outside in pubs and in restaurants. And oh yeah, well, remember what happened when we did that? You know, in the summer last year, yeah, everybody got COVID, and then a variant popped up. Great idea, but you know they don't care because they've got an agenda. They want to sell newspapers, and they're all, you know, the libertarian Tories, and they're gonna drive it home no matter what, no matter what the facts are. And all we've got to do, you know, we've got to present an alternative, and we've got to mobilize on social media through the platforms that we can, that don't require billionaires to fund us, and, you know, chip in and fund proper journalism that will hold people to account.
Indeed. Before we come to the final questions, talking of mobilizing on social media, if you're watching the video, if you're watching us live, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like the video, and also you'll find the link to the Double Down News Patreon in the description. So do as Sam says and make sure you support our work, and also, of course, our friends at Byline Times. Sam, I agree with you completely on the fact, obviously, that there are a lot of alternative outlets that are doing great work, and you know we rely on our supporters to ensure that we can do it. I am a little bit concerned about the idea that our media ecology could be about to get a lot worse with the creation of the likes of GB News. I know that this is something that you've been talking about today. Do you think that their creation, I mean, obviously they've got an incredible amount of money behind them, or so it seems. I've seen them sort of posting the videos of their studio construction and so on. And obviously we see the almost daily sort of announcements of hires that they've brought in and so on. I mean, how do you think that's going to affect the sort of media ecology once they come about?
I mean, it's going to be interesting to see. I think they're going to run into a lot of problems quite quickly, quite honestly. We'll see. I might have to eat my words on this. So, you know, I say don't quote me, but there are, you know, hundreds of people watching. So they probably will. But hey ho, I think that GB News probably isn't going to be as successful as many people predict. I think that TV has a very high bar for financial sustainability. They've got, what is it, 60 million, I think they've been funded with so far. And they're going to they will burn through that in 3 years. So they need to get sustainable in 3 years, which is actually quite a tall order in the media ecosystem where people want stuff for free and have expected stuff for free for a long time. I think as well, the world's shifting away from traditional broadcast, scheduled broadcast, which seems like what they're trying to do. And it's evidently shifted a lot more towards what you're doing, the likes of Byline TV are doing, you know, the short, sharp, YouTube-orientated, nimble, on-your-feet videos. So I don't see anything. I mean, obviously, I have no point of reference politically with GB News, so I don't know how much their content might resonate with their intended audience. But I don't see anything from their setup so far that gives me great concern to worry. I mean, if the right's going to pile £60 million into a project, I'd say GB News hopefully isn't a too bad option for the left. I mean, it'll give progressive outlets like ours a lot to sort of counterbalance against and say, look, you know, they're doing this, and people should support us, and you know, this is the alternative and all that sort of stuff, which will be a good thing in some ways. And I think ultimately their message won't be very potent. And I won't be too shocked if they've got, you know, just a few hundred people tuning into Andrew Neil and dancing around a studio with a Union Jack emblazoned across his chest. So yeah, I'm not too worried.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think, you know, there's an interesting point there about whether they are spending their money wisely in terms of where they're putting it. It certainly seems like a lot of the alternative sort of right-wing media in the US hasn't gone down that route, where they've sort of captured audiences. They've gone online, or obviously also radio has been incredibly popular for them, as opposed to sort of creating a broadcast TV channel.
I think as well, like you've seen lots of outlets in the UK jump from Britain to America right? You've seen that quite often. The Spectator's got a USA edition. The New Statesman has. The Guardian will have. I think the Independent has as well, because it's such a huge audience. There's just the potential pool of people to subscribe to your content is massive. You've rarely seen it where they've come in the other direction and it works, because there's just not the optimum value in the amount of people living in the UK and believing a particular point of view and being, I mean, if you think, so you've got to live in the UK, you've got to believe a political point of view, you've got to be engaged enough to want to subscribe or watch or listen and access it in a way that's quite, obscure and isn't just tuning into BBC News. And then you've got to enjoy the content. And each of those funnels makes it narrower and narrower and narrower. And I'd say that that's not millions of people, I don't think. And that's what they need to make it sustainable.
I think you're right, Sam. And on that note, I just want to say a huge thank you to you for joining us tonight. It's been a really, really interesting discussion, and it has completely flown by as we thought that it would. And thank you as well to the hundreds and hundreds of people, 1,000 that we've had live with us all the way through. Again, obviously a shout out to all of Sam's work and the great work that the people at Byline Times are doing. Great fans and friends of ours at Double Down News. We really appreciate your support and everything you're doing. And a reminder to all of you, if you can, please do support the work that we're doing at Double Down News by visiting the link in the description. The Patreon link is there for you to support our work going forward, whether it's these live shows or the videos that you see us producing as we go forward. Every single person's support makes a difference. So join the future of journalism and join Double Down News.